Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really provocative interview with one of Australia's most lasting political figures, Pauline Hanson. We're going to unpack the key arguments that are really stirring up the political conversation down under. So the whole interview really hinges on this one core idea, the claim that public opinion is finally coming around to views she's held for years. She says she saw the writing on the wall a long, long time ago. So, okay, let's really dig into what that actually means. All right, so we've organized this whole discussion into 5 main parts. First up, a look at the changing political mode. Then we'll get into culture and national identity. After that, it's gender, family, and society. Then her big critiques of major institutions. And finally, we'll wrap up with her vision for Australia's future. All right, first up, the political mood. The interview kicks off by linking this feeling of a big shift in the country's attitude directly to a jump in the polls for her party. So what's really behind this shift? Well, the interview points to a few key things. You've got the huge pressure of the cost of living. That's a big one. Then there's this feeling of being politically homeless, where people feel like none of the major parties are speaking for them. Throw in a deep distrust of politicians in general, a sense that national pride is fading, and even some worries coming from migrant communities. And what you get is presented as this perfect storm, pushing voters to look for something different. And that whole idea of a shifting mood? Well, it leads us right into our next big topic. The debate around culture and national identity. Okay, so before we get any deeper, it's super important we get on the same page about how Australian culture is defined in this interview. It's not some vague idea. It's laid out as a very specific mix of 3 elements: the country's laws, its lifestyle, and its history. This definition is basically the launchpad for everything that follows. And with that definition in mind, you can see how it's used to build this really strong critique of multiculturalism. The argument made is that the policy has failed, and not because of things like food or festivals, but because it's supposedly created a clash between different laws and beliefs. The bottom line, according to the interview, is that it's created division, not the melting pot it was supposed to be. And this critique gets really sharp when it's applied to Islam. This quote from the interview frames it not just as a religion, but as a political ideology, one that's presented as being totally incompatible with that specific definition of Australian culture and way of life we just talked about. Okay, so we've gone from the big picture of national culture, and now the interview really zooms in on social issues, specifically some really contentious topics like gender, the family, and today's societal norms. So, to really drive a point home, the interview brings up this pretty stark statistic: the claim that men make up 75% of all suicides. This number is used as evidence for a major crisis facing men and boys, one that's argued to be completely overlooked in the broader public conversation. And that statistic becomes the jumping-off point for a critique of ideas like toxic masculinity. The interview basically asks, if this is what's happening, why are young men and boys supposedly being taught in schools that they themselves are the problem? And it definitely doesn't stop there. The interview lays out a whole series of other really provocative arguments. The gender pay gap? It's called a lie. The family court system? It's accused of having a built-in bias against men. Modern feminism is described as being driven by people who just hate men. And things like gender quotas are rejected because, in this view, they don't actually reward merit. So, building on all those social critiques, the interview then widens its lens even further to take aim at the integrity and purpose of some of Australia's core institutions. Okay, now this next part is really interesting. It lays out this stark comparison of political thinking. According to the interview, left-wing thinking is painted as being based on ideology, as aggressive, and as defending topics without real knowledge. On the other hand, right-wing thinking is framed as being more realistic, more grounded, and not aggressive. And you can see how that worldview leads directly to some sharp criticism of key institutions. Universities get accused of indoctrination, with lecturers just pushing their own agendas. The courts? They're seen as being way too soft on crime and failing to deliver real justice. And as for police and teachers, the argument is that their authority has been so watered down, they can't even enforce basic discipline anymore. Right, so after laying out all of these critiques and problems across society, the interview doesn't just leave it there. It wraps up by presenting a very specific, very bold vision for the country's future. And this is really the grand finale. The key takeaway here is just how immediate and sweeping these proposed changes are. They're presented as day one priorities. We're talking about massively cutting regulations, all the red and green tape, drilling for more gas and oil, pulling out of the Paris Agreement, slashing immigration numbers, and putting a hard stop to foreign ownership of land and housing. And this really gets to the core philosophy driving all of those policies. The stated goal here is to create a nation of resilient people who are responsible for themselves. The whole idea is to end what's described as an unsustainable reliance on government handouts. And that brings us to our final thought. The interview lays out a very clear story of a nation in decline and offers a really bold, really decisive plan for how to fix it. So we'll leave you with this question to think about. What role does this brand of politics play in shaping a nation's future?